3,000 years ago, on the southern coast of the eastern Mediterranean, lived a people remembered by history only as villains. The Philistines. The giant Goliath came from among them. So did Delilah, who cut the strength from Samson. They seized the sacred ark itself. For 30 centuries, their very name has meant the brutish, foreign enemy, a people who seemed to rise from nowhere around the year 1200 BCE, carrying a culture unlike anything on that shore. For 150 years, scholars argued over where they had sailed in from. Every clue they found was circumstantial. Then a team of scientists drew precious genetic material from the inner ear bones of 4 infants buried beneath the floors of Philistine homes. And the answer those bones gave was far stranger and far more human than the long debate had ever prepared anyone to hear. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you first have to understand how little anyone truly knew. The Philistines were not a single city or a wandering tribe. They were a confederation, 5 great cities strung along the southeastern shore of the Mediterranean: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, a name that still sits on the map today. Together, these cities formed a land the ancient world called Philistia, governed not by one king, but by a council of lords who met to decide the matters that touched them all. They appeared on that coast at the very end of the Bronze Age, around the year 1200 BCE, and from the moment they arrived, they were unmistakably different. We know them best, of course, as villains. The most famous stories told about them cast them as the great enemy. Goliath, the towering champion from the city of Gath, struck down by a shepherd boy with a sling and a single stone. Delilah, who coaxed the secret of his strength from Samson and then cut it away while he slept. It was the Philistines who captured the sacred ark and carried it home as a trophy, and the Philistines whose armies broke the first kings of their neighbors on the open plain. In the oldest written accounts of the region, they were the outsiders, the people who did not belong, the enemy against whom a nation defined itself. But strip away the old stories and a far deeper puzzle remains. Because the Philistines were not invented by their enemies, they were real, and the ground they lived on still holds the proof. And everything that ground reveals points to the same strange fact. These people did not grow slowly out of the world around them. They arrived. Before them, this coast belonged to the Canaanites, the indigenous people who had farmed and traded these shores since long before written history began. Their cities, their gods, their pottery, their way of building and burying and cooking, all of it formed a single continuous tradition stretching back thousands of years. And then, almost abruptly, in the layers of earth that mark the beginning of the Iron Age, something new pushes through. New styles, new tastes, new ways of living that owe nothing to the Canaanite world and everything to somewhere else. The Philistines felt foreign to the people who lived beside them, and they felt foreign for a reason. Their culture seemed to belong to another sea entirely, as though a piece of a distant world had been lifted up and set down on this particular stretch of coast. For the people of the ancient Levant, the Philistines were the strangers who came from across the water. The question was, which water, which world, which vanished place had sent them? For more than a century, that question consumed scholars. They sifted the pottery, studied the bones of the animals these people ate, traced the shapes of their houses and the names of their gods, searching for the thread that would lead back to the homeland. And the clues were everywhere, scattered through the soil, waiting to be read. But a clue was not a proof. And for the longest time, proof was exactly what no one could find. Start with the pottery, because that is where the trail truly begins. When archaeologists dug into the earliest Philistine layers, they pulled out vessels that stopped them in their tracks. bowls, jugs, and great mixing craters decorated with spirals and birds and geometric bands, painted in a style that had no business being on this coast. It was Aegean. It belonged to the world of the Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age Greeks whose civilization rose on the far side of the Mediterranean, more than 1,000 kilometers away. The resemblance was not vague. It was unmistakable. And yet, when the clay itself was tested, it turned out to be local. These were not imported treasures carried across the sea. They were Aegean designs, made by Aegean hands, using the mud of a Canaanite shore. The houses told the same story. The Canaanites cooked their food in closed ovens, as they always had. But inside Philistine homes, archaeologists found something different. A single open hearth set at the center of the room. The meal cooked over it in the open air. That was not a Canaanite habit. It was an Aegean one, the way people kept their fires in the homes of distant Greece. Even the garbage spoke. Sifting through the refuse pits of Philistine settlements, archaeologists kept finding the bones of pigs. That alone was unusual on this coast, but the deeper detail was stranger still. The breed of pig was not the kind native to the Levant. Its closest relatives lived in the Aegean. Somewhere in their journey, these people had brought their swine with them, or imported the animals soon after, and the bones lay scattered through their kitchens like a signature left in the dirt. There was a script that looked Aegean rather than Semitic. There were styles of dress and weaponry that echoed the far west. And there was one of the oldest clues of all, set down in an ancient text. It recorded plainly that the Philistines came from a place called Kaftor, a name that most scholars identify with the island of Crete. Egypt, too, left a record. In the inscriptions of the pharaoh Ramesses III, carved on his mortuary temple walls, a sea people called the Peliset appear among the invaders who swept the eastern Mediterranean, and many scholars have long linked that name directly to the Philistines. So the picture seemed almost complete. Pottery, hearths, pigs, script, dress, and the records of Egypt, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them pointing west, toward the collapsing world of the Aegean. And yet, none of it was proof. That was the maddening problem. Because every single one of those clues could be explained another way. Pottery styles travel along trade routes without a single person ever migrating. Tastes spread. Fashions are copied. A people can fall in love with a foreign style and imitate it for generations while remaining entirely themselves. Skeptics argued exactly this, that the Philistines were local Canaanites who had simply absorbed the fashions of a glamorous neighbor across the water. The objects could suggest, they could hint, they could point, but they could not testify. A pot cannot tell you who shaped its maker. For that, you would need a witness who carried the answer inside their own body. That witness arrived in the summer of 2016. After more than 30 years of digging at Ashkelon, one of the 5 great Philistine cities, archaeologists uncovered something that had never been found before. A Philistine cemetery. For the first time, here were the people themselves, not their pottery, not their hearths, not the bones of their pigs, but the men, women, and children of Philistia, laid in the ground where they had lived and died. And bones, unlike pottery, carry a record that cannot be copied or borrowed. They carry the body's own testimony, written in the language of genetics. A team of scientists from the Max Planck Institute, working alongside the expedition that had spent decades at Ashkelon, set out to read it, but reading it was far harder than it sounds. Genetic material is fragile. It breaks down over time, and it breaks down fastest in heat and dryness, which is precisely the climate of the southern Levant. For years, this was the Great Barrier. The dead of this region simply did not preserve their secrets well. So the researchers turned to the 2 places in the human body where genetic material survives the longest: the hard interior of the teeth and the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, the most resistant bone we possess. From these, painstakingly, they drew out what time had nearly destroyed. In the end, they recovered usable duh from 10 individuals, And the way those 10 were spaced in time is what made the study so powerful. They did not all come from one moment. They came from 3. The first group lived in the Bronze Age, before the Philistines are thought to have arrived. The second group lived in the early Iron Age, at the very dawn of Philistine culture, the first generations of these strange newcomers. And the third group lived in the later Iron Age, centuries further on, long after the Philistines had settled into the land. 3 windows opening onto 3 different moments in the life of a single city. A way to watch a population not as a snapshot, but across time itself. They began with the baseline, the oldest group, the Bronze Age dead who had lived on this coast before the Great Change, and the result was clear and unsurprising. These people were genetically indistinguishable from the wider population of the ancient Levant. They were, in the plainest terms, local. Their ancestry tied them firmly to the Canaanite world that had occupied this shore for thousands of years. Whatever was coming, it had not yet arrived. This was the coast as it had always been, the people as they had always been, the deep, continuous root from which everything in the region had grown. That baseline mattered enormously because it gave the scientists something almost no one ever has, a before, a clear genetic portrait of who lived here first, captured in the bones, against which any newcomer would stand out instantly. And then they turned to the second group. The 4 infants buried beneath the floors of Philistine homes, laid to rest at the very moment the new culture appears in the ground. The first true Philistines anyone had ever tested. The code inside their bones said something the Bronze Age dead had never said. The 4 infants carried something foreign in their blood. Woven through their ancestry was a genetic component that simply had not been there before, a signature absent from every one of the Bronze Age dead who had come before them on this coast. It was European. Specifically, it traced back to the southern edge of Europe, to the lands and islands of the Mediterranean's far side. The continuity that had held unbroken for thousands of years, the deep Canaanite root, had suddenly been joined by something that came from across the sea. This was the proof that the pottery could never give. Because a genetic signature cannot be traded, it cannot be copied, imitated, or admired from a distance. A pot can travel 1,000 kilometers in the hold of a ship while its maker stays home, but ancestry only moves one way, carried in the bodies of living people who cross the water, settle, and have children. The foreign element in those infants meant that human beings, not just their fashions, had made the journey. People had come. When the researchers searched for where those people had come from, the strongest matches led west and north toward the Aegean and to the islands of the Mediterranean, Crete, Sardinia, and the distant Iberian shore. The single best supported model pointed to the Bronze Age population of Crete, the very island that one ancient account had named long ago, recording that the Philistines came from a place called Kaftor, a line written down nearly 3,000 years ago, set aside as legend, now lined up quietly with the genetic code of 4 buried children. And the timing fit a story far larger than one city. The arrival of these newcomers lined up with one of the most catastrophic moments in the ancient world, the collapse of the Bronze Age. Across the eastern Mediterranean, great civilizations were falling, cities burning, whole kingdoms vanishing within the span of a few decades. Out of that disintegrating world came waves of displaced people, the seafaring groups the Egyptians recorded as the Sea Peoples, moving along the coasts in search of somewhere to begin again. The Philistines, it now seemed, were among them, refugees from a dying world, washing up on a new shore and rebuilding their lives in the ruins of someone else's. Here, honesty demands a pause. This was not a vast study. It rested on the genomes of 10 individuals, and the crucial foreign signal came from just 4 infants. The scientists themselves were careful to say so. They could see clearly that the new ancestry came from southern Europe, but they could not yet name the exact island or shore it sailed from, not until more ancient genetic material is recovered from across the Aegean. This is not a weakness in the finding. It is the discipline of it, the difference between what the evidence shows and what we wish it showed. What it shows is enough. People crossed the sea, exactly as the oldest accounts had long hinted. So the century-old question finally had an answer. The Philistines really did come from the west. But the most extraordinary thing the DNA revealed was not where these people came from. It was what happened to them after they arrived. To see it, the scientists turned to their third and final group, the later Iron Age dead. The people who lived in Ashkelon, roughly 2 centuries after those 4 infants, were laid beneath the floors. The Philistines were still here. Their cities still stood. Their culture was still flourishing on the coast. By every outward measure, this was the same people. And so the researchers read their bones, expecting to find that same foreign signature, the European thread that had announced the newcomers so clearly 200 years before. It was gone. The signal that had blazed so brightly in the infants had, in the space of a few generations, simply dissolved. The later Philistines were, genetically, almost indistinguishable from the local population of the Canaanite Levant. The ancestry that had crossed the sea, the very thing that marked these people as foreign, had been absorbed back into the deep Canaanite gene pool until it all but vanished from the record. The newcomers had not kept to themselves. They had married into the world they found, generation after generation, and with every marriage, the foreign signature grew fainter, diluted by the overwhelming presence of the local people around them. Within about 200 years, biologically speaking, the migrants had melted into the coast. Now hold those 2 facts side by side, because together they form one of the most remarkable things the DNA revealed. Genetically, the Philistines had become local within 2 centuries, and yet the Philistine culture, their distinct identity, their cities, their name, endured for 4 more centuries beyond that. 600 years, all told, of a people who knew exactly who they were. They went on building their cities and worshiping in their temples and calling themselves what they had always called themselves, long after the foreign blood that first set them apart had thinned away to almost nothing. Sit with that for a moment, because it overthrows something we quietly assume. We tend to think that a people is a matter of blood, that to be Philistine was to descend from those who sailed in from the west, and that when the bloodline faded, the people must have faded with it. But that is not what happened here. The genes and the identity came apart. The thing that made them foreign and the thing that made them Philistine were never the same thing. They stopped being genetically distinct from their neighbors long before they stopped being Philistines. The blood said one story, the culture said another, and the culture, it turns out, was the stronger and the longer lived of the 2. An identity, once kindled, did not need to keep being refreshed by new arrivals from across the sea. It had taken root in something other than ancestry. It lived in the pottery and the language and the gods and the memory, in the things people do and say and pass to their children, none of which is written in a genome at all. Which raises a question most of us never think to ask, a question these silent bones place directly in front of us. If a people can outlive its own bloodline by 400 years, then what exactly is a people? What is the thing that actually ends? The answer, it turns out, was hiding in the Philistines from the very beginning. Because they were never a pure people, not even on the day they arrived. Look closely at their earliest settlements, and the blend is already there. The archaeology suggests that from the moment these cities took shape, a large share of those living in them, perhaps half or more, were local Canaanites, the very people the newcomers had settled among. The migrants did not arrive and replace a population. They arrived and joined one. The DNA only confirms what the dirt had already hinted. The foreign thread was real, but it was woven into a local fabric from the first stitch. And everything we know about how they lived points the same way. The newcomers do not appear to have arrived as whole families and nations. The evidence suggests a great many of them were men, warriors, and seafarers carried east by a collapsing world, and that finding wives among the local population was among their first concerns once survival was secured. So they married Canaanite women. Their children were raised in homes that were half foreign and half local from the cradle. Within a generation, the line between newcomer and native had already begun to blur. Their gods tell the same story. You might expect a people from across the sea to carry their own deities with them and hold to them fiercely. Instead, the Philistines worshipped gods whose names were already old on that coast long before they came, gods that belonged to the Canaanite world they had entered. They took up the faith of the land they settled in. They very likely took up its language too, the speech of the people they married and traded with and lived beside. Piece by piece, the foreign became local, not by force, but by the ordinary gravity of living together. So this is what a people really was, at least here, on this shore. Not a bloodline, not a sealed inheritance passed down pure from some distant homeland. The Philistines were a culture that absorbed whoever it met, a way of living strong enough to hold its shape, even as the people carrying it changed completely underneath. The migrants who sailed in from the west dissolved into the population within a few generations. But the identity they had kindled, the thing that made a city Philistine, outlasted their genes by 500 years. And then comes the final turn, the one that makes the whole story almost unbearable in its irony. The name. Of everything these people made, it was their name that proved the most durable thing of all. More than 1,000 years after the Philistines first stepped onto that coast, long after they had any distinct existence left to lose, the Roman Empire crushed a rebellion in this same region. And when the Romans renamed the defeated province as a deliberate insult, stripping away the name of the people who had revolted, they reached back across the centuries and chose the name of that province's most ancient enemy. They called it Palestina, after the Philistines. That name has never left. It still sits on the map today, the last living echo of a people whose own blood vanished into the coast 3,000 years ago. So in the end, the DNA revealed no master race, no vanished super civilization, no mystery sealed away from us by the distance of 3,000 years. It revealed something far more human. Migrants fleeing a collapsing world, who crossed the sea, built cities on a foreign shore, married the people they found there, and within a few generations became them. The villains of the old accounts turn out to be a lesson in how peoples are actually made, never pure, never permanent. A brief foreign spark folded into a local fire until the two can no longer be told apart. Identity, these silent bones suggest, was never carried in the blood at all. So when you read that ancient name on a map today, remember what it truly is. The last echo of a people whose own genes disappeared long ago and who were, even at the very beginning, already a mixture.